Good morning. We want to welcome, thank you very much. We want to welcome everyone to the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, along with the Budget Subcommittee 5 on Public Safety. We want to welcome Mr. Jones Sawyer and his members. I also would like to welcome Assemblymember Stone, the chair of the Assembly Judicial Committee. Today we'll be discussing the audit report of the judicial branch that was requested last year by Assemblymember Jones Sawyer and completed in January of this year. I certainly want to thank him for his leadership, for moving forward with such audit that leads us here today. The state audit report is very critical of the oversight and the fiscal decisions of the judicial branch and its staff, agency, the Administrative Office of the Court, the AOC. The state audit identified issues with efficiency, transparency, accountability in her report. In fact, the state auditor's report reported that the Judicial Council has failed to properly oversee the AOC, which has resulted in questionable spending practices by that department. The state auditor also reported that some of these decisions may have been detrimental to the rest of the judicial branch, especially in light of the significant budget cuts to the judicial branch and the courts. Members of our community have felt the impact of the budget cuts of the judicial branch. These cuts have resulted in more than 200 court closures, reduction in services and hours, and nearly 4,000, and I want to underscore 4,000 staff have lost their jobs. We must hold the Judicial Council, the AOC, and the local courts accountable for their part in the lack of access to justice. But we must also do our part to restore the essential services to our local communities. Today, we will examine the issues at the Judicial Council and the Administrative Office that has been identified by the state auditor. We will start with an overview of the trial court's funding by the Legislative Analyst Office. We will also get a detailed review of the significant findings and the recommendations that the state auditor will provide along with her staff. Finally, we will hear representatives from the Judicial Council and the AOC. I realize this audit was released more than 60 days ago, which may not be, will not have all the essentials that it needs to it to respond to changes and the recommendations set forth by the state auditor. However, in light of the report's findings and the recommendations, I would be very interested in hearing whether the Judicial Council and the AOC are committed to making meaningful changes and in areas that the state auditor has expressed her concerns in her report. I want to, at this time, invite Mr. Jones Sawyer to make some opening comments, followed by Mr. Stone, who chairs the Judicial Committee, to also make some opening comments. Mr. Jones Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for convening this. I guess I should speak since I'm probably the problem child that got us all here today. And let me just state, I didn't get here to have an audit just off a whim. There were some things that were very troubling to me when I first got here, and I am very, very sensitive to the fact that there have been perceived budget cuts of $1 billion or more to the courts since 2008. However, from my perspective, being new here after 2 years, when I first got here, I noticed that the legislature, the governor, had pumped quite a bit of money into the courts, and I've also assisted in the effort. And even though the courts may say they're $1 billion in the hole or $1 billion been taken away from them, we can't forget they got 500 to 600 million in CCMS, court case management system. They got another 100 million from the legislature in 2013, and I might add, in 2013, when we gave them 100 million in my district, they closed a court that helped women who were involved in sex trafficking get off the street. They thought that was a priority, to close that, instead of trying to help young women who are being victimized in my district every day. We gave them another 200 million in 2014. In the report itself, it calls to question another 386 million in questionable spending, 30 million on cars, cell phones, and today the governor has asked that we give the courts another 100 million. From my perspective, we've given the courts 1.316 billion to 1.4 billion, and they still reduce staffing, they still cut courts, and they're still crying about another 1.7 billion that was redirected from the court construction funds to court operations and state general funds. From my perspective, there's probably close to $2 billion that have been pushed into the courts. And so the real question is, what the hell did you do with that money? What did you do to effectively manage the courts in a way that we did not have to close courts, people do not have to travel 100 or more miles to get access to justice? And so as I looked at the court structure, as I sat with several members of my committee and the auditor about what to audit, I wanted a more comprehensive audit. I wanted to audit construction funds and see if they're being managed properly, because there's billions of dollars there that may not be managed properly. And what I found is, right now the Judicial Court has what I call analysis paralysis. They lead by committee. You have a Revenue and Expenditure Subcommittee, 6 trial court PJs, 7 court executives. You have another trial court budget committee, advisory committee, 15 trial court PJs and 15 court executives. The Judicial Council has 21 voting members, including judiciary, legislative, and state bar participants, and then another 58 PJs, presiding judges in the trial courts. So the real question is, who is in charge? Like with the legislature, you have to have one person in charge, whether that's the Speaker, the Governor, or the President Pro Tem. You cannot lead by committee. And so I'm hoping that with new management that is coming in, specifically with Martin Yoshino, that as I tried to work with the Chief Jar 2 years ago, that we finally have someone in place who is going to actually make some critical evaluation of the entire department and come up with some constructive ways that we can move forward. I love the thing that we did with WAFM, the workload allocation funding model, but I am still not comfortable that there's any accountability. There seems to be relatively no oversight, and there's no transparency. And this audit and the audits that I've looked at that have been done internally within the judicial system basically justifies the status quo. We can no longer manage the courts with the status quo. If we do that and expect a different result, we all know what happens. And so I am ecstatic about this audit. Not only I'm happy to hear from the auditor. I think they've done a remarkable job in the limited scope that they have, and I'm looking forward to some ways that we can, one, get accountability, transparency, and ultimately that this body can have some type of oversight on how the funds are being moved. I understand this whole concept of 3 branches of government, but there's a larger branch of government that hangs over all 3 branches, and that's the people. And we manage the people's money. And at the end of the day, that's who all 3 are answering to, and we're just vessels for that. Thank you.
Mr. Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chair Jones-Sawyer, thank you for asking for the audit last year, having been a part of the Budget Subcommittee conversations as well as the Judiciary Committee last session as we struggled with trial courts funding and trying to understand how we best can serve the people of California with an at least adequate courts system. And the audit ultimately is an opportunity for us to have this conversation, understand better how finances are being used to exercise our obligation of oversight. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the courts and from the auditor on the results of this audit, get some responses, and then continuing the conversation as we enter into our budget conversation about how we can adequately fund courts, the trial courts in California, and get services to the people who need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stone and Mr. Jones Sawyer. Want to take this opportunity to thank all the committee members for coming together, my Vice Chair, Senator Roth, and the entire committee for coming this morning to hear regarding this oversight issue. At this point in time, I want to invite Ms. Anita Lee, the Legislative Analyst Office, for her presentation and her testimony. And as she is coming, we would certainly hope, at least as the chair of this committee, that anyone that comes before this committee that presents and gives testimony is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We would hate to find out that someone was misleading in their testimony. At least, certainly, I would hate for that to take place. And so we would, again, hope that you will provide the testimony and the presentation the best of your ability as well as your knowledge. Thank you very much, Ms. Lee, for joining us, and you may open up and introduce yourself.
Great. Anita Lee with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Before you, I think you each have a copy of the handout that we've prepared for the discussion today that was distributed by the sergeants. Staff asked us to prepare an overview of how trial courts are funded to provide some context for the conversation you'll be having this morning. So we'll be walking through this handout. For the purposes of the handout, we focused on 2013-14 because it's the most recent year for which actual expenditures exist. So all of our comments are really going to focus on that fiscal year. If you turn to page 1 of the handout, we first provide an overview of total judicial branch funding. The judicial branch receives revenues from multiple funding sources, including the State General Fund, civil filing fees, criminal penalties and fines, county maintenance of effort payments, federal funds, and local revenues collected by individual trial courts. As you can see in the figure before you, in 2013-14, total funding for the judicial branch was nearly $3.3 billion. Of this amount, $1.2 billion, or 37% of the total funding for the judicial branch, came from the general fund. If you turn to page 2 of your handout, we then show how these funds were distributed across the judicial branch. So the judicial branch consists of the trial courts in each of the state's 58 counties, the state courts consisting of the Supreme Court and the Courts of Appeal, and then the statewide branch entities consisting of the Judicial Council, the Judicial Branch Facility Program, and the Habeas Corpus Resource Center. In the pie chart before you, you can see that in 2013-14, trial courts received 81% of the total funding to the judicial branch. Most of this funding was allocated directly to the trial courts. However, a portion of it was provided indirectly, which means that instead of being given to the trial courts, it was actually used for purposes that ultimately would benefit them. In the remaining pages of the handout, we'll be focusing a little bit more on this direct versus indirect funding to the trial courts. On pages 3 and 4 of the handout, we first take that look at funding that's allocated directly to the trial courts. It really consists of 2 types of funding. There are local revenues and there are state funds. So first, regarding the local revenues are a small portion of the funds that would be in this category. Individual trial courts collect local revenues. They can consist of local fees, revenues to support local programs, and interest income. Local revenues are retained by the individual trial court that collected it, and it is not appropriated by the legislature. Second, trial courts directly receive a portion of the total state funding that is appropriated by the legislature as local assistance dollars to support their operations. Upon allocation to the individual trial courts generally have complete discretion in how they use those funds. The allocation of the funds to the individual trial courts is determined by Judicial Council. With certain exceptions, such as funding for court interpreters, Judicial Council generally has significant flexibility in how they allocate to the individual trial courts. Until recently, Judicial Council generally based each trial court's allocation on their historic share of the statewide allocation. And so this led to some funding inequities amongst the courts. In April of 2013, Judicial Council approved a new methodology, which was mentioned, WAFM, to begin correcting for these inequities by allocating state funding based on workload instead. Beginning in 2013-14, the Judicial Council began to phase in WAFM over a 5-year period, with an increasing portion of funds being allocated under WAFM each year. Under the plan, 50% of state funds allocated directly to the trial courts would eventually be allocated under WAFM. In addition, any augmentations that were not designated for a specified purpose would be allocated using WAFM. To the extent that such funds were provided, an equal amount of funding that would have been allocated under the old methodology would be shifted and funded under WAFM instead. On page 5 of the handout, we then turn our attention to funding that is provided indirectly to the trial courts. We would note for your purposes that the concerns that are contained in the auditor's reports related to expenditures, local assistance, state operations would likely fall within this category of funds. And so in this category, we have funds that are appropriated to trial courts, and then we have funds that are appropriated to Judicial Council. So first, the annual state budget does include local assistance funding that is appropriated to the trial courts for operations but is not directly given to them. Instead, the funds, like I mentioned before, would support certain programs and services. Examples include monies that are paid by the state controller's office, such as for judicial salaries, monies that are paid by Judicial Council to third-party vendors, such as certain expenditures for certain court-ordered dependency council providers, and monies that are used to help support various programs and services upon approval by Judicial Council, such as certain expenditures from the Judicial Branch's Improvement and Modernization Fund. Second, the annual state budget also includes funding for Judicial Council for state operations, a portion of which is then to benefit the trial courts. So for example, in 2013-14, about $133 million was appropriated to Judicial Council. Of this amount, about $19 million, or 14%, was to benefit the trial courts. Examples of the use for the funds in 2013-14 included case management systems for certain courts, a pilot program to provide legal representation for eligible low-income litigants in certain civil cases, and other programs and services administered by Judicial Council. If you turn to the final page, page 6 of your handout, we then provide a table that summarizes all of these funds that are supporting the trial courts in 2013-14. As you can see in the table before you, the total funding was approximately $2.6 billion. Of this amount, about $2.3 billion, or 86% of the monies, were directly allocated to the trial courts. Of this amount, about 92% consisted of state funds that were appropriated by the legislature. The remaining $383 million, or 14% of monies supporting trial courts in the year, were provided indirectly. Of this amount, about 95% consisted of state funds that were appropriated by the legislature to support trial courts. So with that, we conclude our presentation, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Members, we will invite you to queue up to ask Ms. Lee any questions. Ms. Lee, before we do that, I want to ask you one question. Please explain how the presentation of the judicial branch budget and expenditure information compares with other agencies.
The judicial branch budget has quite a bit of flexibility in it. It is not the only department like that, but there are other departments that have more constraints, and by that there are specific line items that govern every action that's taken. And so if fund shifts need to happen, there's a process that is laid out. They have a little bit of flexibility, but if they want to transfer funds above a certain threshold, it usually goes through the Department of Finance, and then it comes to the Joint Legislative Budget Audit Committee, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee for evaluation. So it does go through a deliberative process.
Let me ask one other question as a follow-up. Are there any proposed changes to simplify the presentation of the judicial branch budget and make the data more transparent and understandable to the public?
So beginning in 2013-14, the Department of Finance has worked with the judicial branch to take steps to actually simplify or make things more transparent. For example, on page 5 of your handout, when we walked you through the indirect funding to the trial courts, the second category related to the funds appropriated for judicial counsel is now its own line item in the budget. We can actually clearly see that. Prior to that, we actually didn't have that distinction. There was knowledge that these funds were being used on behalf of the trial courts, but it just wasn't clear in terms of how much and what it was being used for. Additionally, in Budget Galley, Department of Finance has made strides in terms of a budget display that would also more clearly indicate what the funds on this same page, the funds appropriated for trial courts that were provided indirectly, what they were used for as well. So there are steps that are being taken. Can there be more steps? Yes, but it's progress.
Thank you very much. Committee members, anyone have any questions for Ms. Lee while she's here? Ms. Lee, thank you very much. I would invite you to please have a seat in the audience and stay in the room if you would, just in case there's further questions that the committee members or myself may have for you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to bring up our State Auditor, Elaine Howe, our State Auditor, for her testimony, her presentation.